There is a photograph taken in the ruins of a German city in 1945. The city has been reduced to rubble, every building broken, every street buried under debris, every familiar landmark erased. And in the center of the photograph, walking through the ruins, is a single figure. You cannot see the face. You cannot tell if it is a soldier or a civilian, a victor or a survivor. The figure is simply walking, moving through the wreckage of a world that no longer exists, towards something the photograph does not show. World War II ended more than 75 years ago. And yet it remains the most present of all historical events, the one that feels closest, the one whose consequences are most visible in the world we inhabit today. The borders of nations, the institutions of international law, the architecture of global trade and diplomacy, the very language with which we discuss good and evil in public life, all of it was shaped, in ways both direct and indirect, by 6 years of war that killed between 70 and 85 million people. The numbers are so large they become abstract. 70 million. 85 million. The mind cannot hold a number that large. It cannot feel it. What the mind can hold are stories, individual moments, specific decisions, particular human beings in particular places making choices whose consequences rippled outward across years and decades and are still rippling now. This is a war that has been told many times. In histories and memoirs and documentaries and films and novels. And yet the telling is never finished, because the war was so vast, so various, so contradictory in its details that no single account can contain it. Every account leaves things out. Every account emphasizes some stories and forgets others. Every account is, in some sense, a partial map of a territory too large to map completely. What follows is not a complete account. It is a collection of details, some famous, some obscure, some that will confirm what you thought you knew, and some that will quietly change the way you understand what happened. They are facts about courage and cowardice, about genius and catastrophic error, about the things ordinary people did under extraordinary pressure, and about the long shadow that 6 years of war cast across everything that came after. Get comfortable. Let's begin. The Second World War did not begin on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. It began earlier, depending on where you draw the line. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale war against China in 1937, a conflict that killed millions before a single German soldier crossed a European border. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The Spanish Civil War, which ended in 1939, served as a testing ground for German and Italian military technology and tactics. The war that history calls World War II was not a single event with a clear beginning. It was a convergence of multiple conflicts that merged, over time, into a single catastrophe. The date September 1, 1939, is a European date, the moment when the war became impossible to ignore in the capitals of Western nations. In Asia, the dying had been happening for years. Adolf Hitler was not German. He was Austrian, born in the town of Braunheim on April 20, 1889, near the border with Bavaria. He moved to Munich in 1913, served in the German army during World War I as an Austrian volunteer, and did not acquire German citizenship until 1932, 1 year before he became Chancellor of Germany. The man who would define German nationalism for a catastrophic decade was, legally and by birth, not German until the final years before he took power. He applied for German citizenship specifically to run for political office. The application was processed by a Nazi-controlled state government that was already aligned with his movement. He became a citizen of the country he would lead to ruin with 11 months to spare. The Enigma machine, the German encryption device whose cracking by Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park is one of the most celebrated intelligence achievements of the war, was not a military invention. It was originally a commercial product, patented in 1918 by a German engineer named Arthur Skerbius and marketed to businesses as a secure communications device. The German military adopted and heavily modified it in the late 1920s and 1930s, adding additional complexity that made it vastly more difficult to crack than the commercial version. The Polish mathematicians who first broke early versions of Enigma in the early 1930s, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rositzky, and Henryk Zygalski, did so using mathematical methods of extraordinary ingenuity. When Poland was invaded in 1939, they passed their work to British and French intelligence. The foundation of Bletchley Park's achievement was built on Polish mathematics. The Dunkirk evacuation of May and June 1940, in which approximately 338,000 Allied soldiers were rescued from the beaches of northern France as German forces closed in, is remembered as a miracle of improvisation, with hundreds of small civilian vessels crossing the English Channel to rescue trapped soldiers. The civilian vessels were real and their contribution was genuine. But the majority of the soldiers were evacuated not by small boats but by Royal Navy destroyers and larger vessels. The small boats, the fishing vessels, pleasure craft, and river ferries that have become the iconic image of Dunkirk carried approximately 1/6 of the total evacuated. The myth of Dunkirk, in which ordinary British citizens in small boats saved the army, is more emotionally true than it is statistically true. It captured something real about the spirit of the moment even as it simplified the logistics considerably. The Manhattan Project, the American program that developed the atomic bomb, employed more than 130,000 people at its peak and cost approximately $2 billion, equivalent to roughly $30 billion today. It was the largest and most expensive scientific and industrial project in human history to that point. And yet it was conducted in such secrecy that Vice President Harry Truman did not know it existed until he became president following Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945. He had been Roosevelt's vice president for 82 days. He was briefed on the bomb's existence the day after Roosevelt died. He made the decision to use it against Japan approximately 3 months later. The man who ordered the use of the most destructive weapon in human history had known of its existence for less than 4 months when he gave the order. The Soviet Union suffered losses in World War II so catastrophic that the scale is still difficult to comprehend. Estimates of Soviet dead range from 26 to 27 million people, military and civilian combined. This represents approximately 14% of the Soviet population at the time. For context, the United States, whose losses were severe, lost approximately 420,000 people, roughly 0.3% of its population. The difference in scale is not simply numerical. It reflects the fundamental difference between the war in the East, a war of annihilation fought with ideological ferocity on both sides, in which the German military command had explicitly ordered the starvation and murder of Soviet civilians, and the war in the West, which was devastating but did not involve the systematic extermination of civilian populations on the same scale. The Western Allied experience of World War II and the Soviet experience of World War II are, in important respects, two different wars. The German military strategy of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, the rapid combined arms offensive that overwhelmed Poland in weeks and France in 6 weeks, was not a doctrine that existed in the German military manuals before the war. The word itself was coined by Western journalists observing the German campaigns, not by German military planners. What the German army had developed was a set of tactical principles emphasizing speed, initiative, and the exploitation of gaps in enemy lines, principles that were applied flexibly by commanders in the field rather than following a rigid prescribed doctrine. The French and British military establishments, observing the same tactical environment, had developed different doctrines emphasizing defensive firepower and centralized control. The collision of these approaches in May 1940 produced a result that shocked the world, including many senior German commanders who had expected the campaign to take much longer. Winston Churchill was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in May 1940, considered by many of his contemporaries to be past his peak, a brilliant but erratic politician whose career had been marked by spectacular successes and spectacular failures in roughly equal measure. He had been the architect of the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in World War I. He had made a series of political misjudgments in the 1930s. He had spent years warning about the German threat while being largely ignored. When he finally reached the highest office, it was in the worst possible circumstances, with France collapsing, the army trapped at Dunkirk, and a significant faction of his own cabinet arguing for a negotiated peace with Germany. His response to that argument, delivered in a cabinet meeting on May 28, 1940, was reported by those present as one of the most galvanizing speeches they had ever heard. It was never written down. The words exist only in the memories of the people who were in the room. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazi regime, was not a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was a bureaucratic process, organized with the administrative precision of a large government program, involving hundreds of thousands of participants across multiple countries and government departments. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the logistics of what they called the final solution, lasted approximately 90 minutes. The minutes of the meeting, which survived the war, are written in the bland administrative language of a planning document. The murder of millions of people was discussed in the same tone as a railway timetable or a budget meeting. The banality of the language is, for many who read it, more disturbing than explicit violence would have been. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 1942 and February 1943 in the ruins of the Soviet city on the Volga, was one of the largest and bloodiest battles in the history of warfare. Total casualties on both sides are estimated at between 1.7 and 2 million killed, wounded, or captured. The German Sixth Army, which had entered the city expecting a rapid victory, was encircled by a Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942 and slowly destroyed over the following 3 months. The commander of the Sixth Army, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, surrendered on February 2, 1943, the first German field marshal to surrender in the war. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal 2 days before the surrender, partly because no German field marshal had ever surrendered and Hitler expected him to die rather than capitulate. Paulus surrendered anyway. He lived until 1957. The D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious military operation in history, involved approximately 156,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel to land on 5 beaches in Normandy. The planning for the operation had begun more than a year earlier and involved an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, designed to convince the German High Command that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, rather than Normandy. The deception was so successful that even after the landings began, Hitler refused to release the panzer reserves that might have driven the Allies back into the sea, believing that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. He maintained this belief for weeks after D-Day. The deception may have been as important to the success of the landings as the landings themselves. Irena Sendler was a Polish social worker who, during the German occupation of Warsaw, smuggled approximately 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto to safety in the Polish underground. She carried infants in toolboxes and burlap sacks, sedated to prevent crying. She maintained detailed records of the children's real names, buried in jars in a garden, so that families might be reunited after the war. She was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943, tortured, and sentenced to death. She was rescued by the Polish underground before the sentence could be carried out. After the war, she dug up the jars and tried to find the children's families. Most of the parents had been killed. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. She did not win. She died in 2008 at the age of 98. The German V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, deployed against Britain and Belgium in 1944 and 1945, killed approximately 9,000 people. The program that produced it killed approximately 12,000 people, slave laborers from concentration camps who worked in the underground factory at Mittelwerk under conditions of extreme brutality. The weapon killed fewer people than its production did. After the war, the engineer who led the V2 program, Wernher von Braun, was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, a program that recruited former Nazi scientists for American military and scientific programs. Von Braun went on to lead the development of the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon in 1969. The rocket that first put humans on the moon was designed by a man who had used slave labor to build weapons for the Third Reich. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, established by Churchill with the instruction to set Europe ablaze, sent hundreds of agents into occupied Europe to conduct sabotage, support resistance movements, and gather intelligence. Approximately a third of the agents sent into France were captured, and many were executed. The SOE recruited women as agents at a time when women were not permitted to serve in combat roles, reasoning that women could travel in occupied territory with less suspicion than men of military age. 39 women were sent into France as SOE agents. 13 were captured and killed. One of them, Nur Inayat Khan, a descendant of an Indian sultan and the first female wireless operator sent into occupied France, was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed at Dachau concentration camp in September 1944. Her last recorded word, spoken as she was executed, was reported as Liberté. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which brought the United States into the war, was intended to destroy the American Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers. It failed. The three carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga, were not in Pearl Harbor on December 7. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was on a similar mission to Midway. The Saratoga was on the west coast for repairs. The Japanese attack sank or damaged 8 battleships and killed 2,403 Americans. It left intact the weapons system that would prove decisive in the Pacific War. 6 months later, at the Battle of Midway, American aircraft carriers destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single engagement and permanently shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. The Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American military aviators in the United States Army Air Corps, flew more than 15,000 individual sorties in the Mediterranean theater between 1943 and 1945, destroying or damaging hundreds of enemy aircraft and vehicles. They were trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, a segregated facility, in a segregated military, in a country where African Americans were denied basic civil rights. They served under white commanding officers and returned home to a country that would not allow them to vote in significant parts of its territory. Their record in combat was exceptional. Their treatment at home was not. The irony of fighting for democracy abroad while being denied it at home was not lost on them. Many of them became central figures in the civil rights movement of the following decade. Operation Mincemeat, one of the most audacious deception operations of the war, involved the British intelligence services obtaining the body of a Welsh homeless man named Glynndwr Michael, who had died of rat poison, dressing him in the uniform of a Royal Marines officer, providing him with false identity documents and fabricated letters suggesting the Allies planned to invade Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily, and floating him off the coast of Spain where German intelligence agents would find him. The Germans found the body, photographed the documents, and believed them. When the Allied invasion of Sicily began in July 1943, significant German forces were positioned in Greece and Sardinia. The operation is estimated to have saved thousands of Allied lives. Glynndwr Michael, the homeless man whose body was used, is buried in Spain under the false name on his documents, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, Operation Meeting House, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city, and left 1 million people homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in history, more destructive in terms of immediate deaths than either of the atomic bombings that followed. The raid used incendiary bombs rather than high explosives, targeting the densely packed wooden residential districts of the city. The fires created a firestorm, a self-sustaining conflagration generating its own wind system that made escape impossible for tens of thousands of civilians. The officer who planned and ordered the raid, General Curtis LeMay, later said that if the United States had lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal for it. The Navajo Code Talkers, approximately 400 Navajo men who served in the United States Marine Corps as military communicators, transmitting messages in a code based on the Navajo language, produced a code that Japanese cryptanalysts never broke. The Navajo language was ideal for the purpose. It was extremely complex, had no written form, was spoken by fewer than 30 people outside the Navajo Nation who were not Navajo, and had no relationship to any language familiar to Japanese intelligence. The Code Talkers served in every major Marine operation in the Pacific Theater from 1942 to 1945. A senior Marine officer later said that the Marine Corps could not have taken Iwo Jima without them. The program was classified until 1968. The Code Talkers received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2001, more than 50 years after the war ended. Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of Nazi Germany and one of Hitler's closest associates, flew solo to Scotland on May 10, 1941, apparently on a self-initiated mission to negotiate peace with Britain. He parachuted from his aircraft over Scotland, was captured by a farmer with a pitchfork, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Hitler declared him insane. The British were baffled. What Hess believed he could achieve, why he believed it, and whether he was acting on any information suggesting British willingness to negotiate, has never been fully established. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served his sentence in Spandau prison in Berlin, for decades the prison's only inmate, until his death in 1987 at the age of 93. He died by hanging himself with an electrical cord. He was the last prisoner of the Nuremberg trials. The Battle of Britain, the air campaign fought between the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe over Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940, was decided, in part, by a navigational error. On the night of August 24, 1940, a German bomber crew dropped their bombs on central London, apparently by mistake, having become disoriented over blacked-out England. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin the following night. The Berlin raid caused little damage but infuriated Hitler, who ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its primary target from RAF airfields, which were close to breaking point, to London. The shift gave the RAF the breathing space it needed to recover. The German decision to bomb cities rather than airfields was a strategic error that may have cost Germany the battle. It was triggered by one crew's navigational mistake on a dark night over a blacked-out island. Nicholas Winton was a 29-year-old British stockbroker who, in the weeks before the war began, organized the rescue of 669 Jewish children from Czechoslovakia, arranging their transport to Britain on 8 trains, finding British families willing to take them, and navigating the bureaucratic obstacles of immigration with remarkable ingenuity. He told almost no one about what he had done. He kept a scrapbook of the children's photographs for decades. In 1988, 49 years after the war, his wife found the scrapbook in their attic and contacted a BBC television program. Winton was invited to appear in the audience without being told why. He found himself surrounded by the people he had saved, now in their 50s and 60s, and their descendants. The footage of his realization, of the moment he understood who was in the room with him, is among the most affecting documents of the war's long aftermath. The German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic, which lasted the entire duration of the war, came closer to defeating Britain than any other German military operation. U-boats sank approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships, killing approximately 30,000 merchant sailors. In the first half of 1942, German submarines were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build replacements. The margin by which the Atlantic supply lines were kept open was, for extended periods, uncomfortably thin. The campaign was ultimately defeated by a combination of factors: improved convoy tactics, long-range aircraft that could cover the mid-Atlantic gap previously beyond air cover, improved sonar technology, and, critically, the breaking of the naval Enigma code at Bletchley Park, which allowed Allied commanders to route convoys around waiting U-boat packs. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in the intelligence war as much as in the water. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to approximately 140,000, as people died of burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. The bomb was dropped by a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay, after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets. The crew did not know the full nature of the weapon they were carrying. They had been told it was an explosive of extraordinary power. When the bomb detonated at 8:15 in the morning, the crew felt two shock waves pass through the aircraft and turned to look at what they had done. The tail gunner, Sergeant George Caron, described what he saw as a bubbling, boiling mass of purple-gray smoke. He took photographs. He was the only crew member with a camera. The photographs he took are among the most reproduced images in human history. Oskar Schindler was a German businessman, member of the Nazi Party, and war profiteer who used Jewish slave labor in his factory in Krakow and ended the war having spent virtually his entire fortune bribing Nazi officials to keep his workers alive. He saved approximately 1,200 people. His motivations are not entirely clear even from the historical record. He left no memoir, gave few interviews, and the accounts of those he saved describe a man who changed, gradually and then decisively, from an opportunist exploiting this situation to someone who could not stop trying to save people even when it made no economic sense. After the war he was largely forgotten, went through several failed business ventures, and was supported financially by the survivors he had saved. He died in 1974. At his request, he was buried in Jerusalem. More than his factory workers and their descendants attended the funeral. The war in the Pacific involved island-hopping campaigns of extraordinary ferocity in which American and Japanese forces fought for islands whose names, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Polilliu, Iwo Jima, became synonymous with costly victory. The Battle of Iwo Jima, fought over 5 weeks in February and March 1945, cost the United States Marines 6,821 dead and 19,217 wounded to capture an island of approximately 21 square kilometers. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 men fought almost entirely from underground, a network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions that made conventional assault enormously costly. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, approximately 216 surrendered. The rest were killed or died of wounds, starvation, or suicide. The photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi, taken on February 23, 1945, became one of the most famous images in American military history. It showed the second flag raised on the summit that day. The first raising had not been photographed. The Nuremberg trials, the international military tribunal that prosecuted senior Nazi officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace, established principles of international law that have shaped the legal framework for the prosecution of atrocities ever since. The concept that individuals can be held legally responsible for acts committed under orders from a government, that following orders is not an absolute defense, was established at Nuremberg. The concept of crimes against humanity as a distinct legal category was established at Nuremberg. The trials were imperfect. The Soviet Union, which had committed its own significant atrocities, sat in judgment of German defendants. Some defendants who deserved prosecution escaped. Some who were executed might have received different sentences in a different legal environment. But the framework they created has outlasted their imperfections. The resistance movements that operated in Nazi-occupied Europe took forms that ranged from armed partisan warfare to the quiet, daily acts of preservation and defiance that left almost no historical record. In the Netherlands, approximately 25,000 Jews were hidden by Dutch citizens at enormous personal risk. Hiding people was punishable by death. Anne Frank and her family were hidden for 2 years and 1 month before being betrayed. In Denmark, when the German occupation authorities moved to deport the country's Jewish population in October 1943, Danish citizens organized a spontaneous rescue operation that transported approximately 7,000 Jews to neutral Sweden in fishing boats over the course of a few nights. The Danish rescue was not organized by the government or the resistance. It was organized by ordinary people who heard what was happening and acted. The Eastern Front, the war between Germany and the Soviet Union, fought across a front that stretched for more than 2,000 kilometers, was the largest and most destructive military campaign in human history. More people died on the Eastern Front than in all other theaters of the war combined. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, involved approximately 3.8 million Axis soldiers, the largest invasion force ever assembled. In the first weeks, the German advance was so rapid that the situation appeared catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured in the opening weeks. And yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. It absorbed losses that would have destroyed most nations, reorganized, and eventually produced the military machine that ground the German army to pieces over 3 years of warfare of almost unimaginable scale. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945 V-Day, with Germany's unconditional surrender. It ended in the Pacific on August 15, 1945 VJ Day, with Japan's announcement of surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. But for millions of people, the war did not end on those dates. Prisoners of war spent months in camps before repatriation. Displaced persons, millions of them, from dozens of countries, lived in camps across Europe for years. Holocaust survivors returned to their home countries to find their families gone, their property taken, and in some cases, the people who had taken it unwilling to return it. The formal end of the war and the actual end of the war's consequences were separated by years, decades, and in some cases, lifetimes. Joseph Stalin's conduct of the war on the Soviet side combined military genius with a paranoia and brutality that cost his own side enormous casualties. In 1937 and 1938, he had purged the Red Army's senior officer corps, executing or imprisoning approximately 35,000 officers, including the majority of the most experienced commanders. The purge left the Red Army in 1941 led largely by officers promoted beyond their experience, which contributed significantly to the catastrophic losses of the war's opening months. Stalin also issued Order 227 in July 1942, the Not One Step Back order, which prohibited Soviet soldiers from retreating without orders and established blocking units tasked with shooting soldiers who attempted to retreat. The order contributed to the Soviet capacity to hold Stalingrad. It also resulted in the execution of an unknown number of Soviet soldiers by their own side. The German occupation of France produced a complex moral landscape that the French have been negotiating ever since. The Vichy government, the French administration that collaborated with Germany, was not simply a puppet imposed by force. It was staffed by French officials who made choices, some under duress and some not, to cooperate with the occupation and in some cases with the deportation of Jews. The French resistance, celebrated in post-war national memory as the dominant French response to occupation, represented a minority of the French population, at least in the early years. The majority of French people under occupation did what most people do under occupation: they tried to survive. The reckoning with what that meant, what collaboration meant, what survival meant, what resistance meant, occupied French public discourse for decades after the liberation. The Manhattan Project's Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear device, conducted in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, produced a yield equivalent to approximately 21 kilotons of TNT, significantly larger than the scientists had predicted. The project's scientific director, J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the explosion, recalled later that a phrase from Hindu scripture came to his mind: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was conducted in secret, but the explosion was visible and felt across a wide area of New Mexico. The official cover story was that a munitions storage facility had exploded. A farmer whose house was blasted by the shockwave was told the same thing. He reportedly did not find it entirely convincing. The children of World War II, the generation born in the late 1930s and early 1940s in the countries most affected by the fighting, carried the war's consequences in ways that only became fully visible decades later. Children who survived the Holocaust. Children who were evacuated from British cities and separated from their families for years. Children in Germany and Japan who grew up in bombed cities, among ruins, in the aftermath of defeat. Children in the Soviet Union who lost fathers, brothers, entire villages. The psychological consequences of wartime childhood, the trauma, the disruption, the grief, were not well understood at the time and were frequently not addressed. The generation that grew up in the war carried it quietly into the decades that followed, in ways that their children and grandchildren sometimes encountered without fully understanding the source. The German Tiger tank, one of the most feared weapons of the war, was, in practical terms, something of a liability. It was extraordinarily powerful and well-armored, capable of destroying Allied tanks at ranges where Allied tank guns could not penetrate its armor. It was also mechanically unreliable, fuel-hungry, too wide to cross many European bridges without special equipment, and so expensive and time-consuming to produce that Germany built fewer than 1,350 of them during the entire war. The Soviet T-34 tank, which was mechanically simpler, faster, easier to produce, and available in vastly greater numbers, the Soviet Union produced approximately 57,000 T-34s, ultimately proved more decisive. A weapon system's effectiveness in war is not simply a function of its individual capabilities. It is a function of how many can be produced, maintained, and deployed. Germany built the better tank. The Soviet Union built more tanks. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps by Allied forces in April and May 1945 confronted soldiers with conditions that many later said they could never fully describe. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, visited the Ohrdruf camp on April 12, 1945, the first Nazi camp liberated by American forces. He ordered every American soldier in the vicinity who was not on the front line to visit the camp, so that there would be witnesses who could not be silenced by denial. He also summoned journalists and members of Congress. He later wrote that he had never experienced an equal sense of shock and nausea. He was concerned, he said, that someday someone might try to claim that what had happened there had not happened. He wanted witnesses. He got them. It was not enough. The siege of Leningrad, in which the German and Finnish armies surrounded the Soviet city of Leningrad for 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, resulted in approximately 800,000 civilian deaths, primarily from starvation. The city was supplied only by a route across the frozen Lake Ladoga in winter, the Road of Life, which trucks traversed at night to avoid German air attack, sometimes breaking through the ice. The daily bread ration in the worst period of the siege was 125 grams for civilians who were not engaged in war-related work, a slice of bread that was frequently adulterated with sawdust and other non-food materials to increase its volume. People ate wallpaper paste, leather, and in documented cases, each other. The city did not fall. The people who held it paid a price that is difficult to look at directly even 80 years later. The war produced an extraordinary concentration of scientific and technological innovation driven by military necessity. Radar, which played a decisive role in the Battle of Britain and in anti-submarine warfare, was developed and refined under wartime pressure. Penicillin, discovered before the war, was mass-produced for the first time to treat Allied wounded. Jet aircraft were developed and deployed by Germany in the final year of the war. Computers, the Colossus machines at Bletchley Park, used to break German codes, were among the first programmable electronic computers in history. The pressurized aircraft cabin, the microwave oven, synthetic rubber, nuclear power all have roots in wartime research and development programs. The war was, among everything else it was, the most intensive period of technological development in human history to that point. Witold Pilecki was a Polish cavalry officer who voluntarily allowed himself to be captured by the Germans in 1940 in order to be sent to Auschwitz concentration camp, where he organized a resistance movement, gathered evidence of what was happening in the camp, and escaped in 1943 to report to the Polish government in exile in London. His reports, sent out of the camp through the resistance network before his escape, were among the earliest detailed accounts of the systematic murder of Jews at Auschwitz. They were not widely believed at the time. After the war, he returned to Communist Poland, where he was arrested by the Polish security services, tortured, tried for espionage, and executed in 1948. The man who had survived Auschwitz voluntarily was killed by the post-war Polish government 3 years after the war ended. The war's end did not bring peace to all of Europe. In Greece, a civil war between communist and nationalist forces, which had begun during the German occupation, continued until 1949, killing approximately 100,000 people. In Poland, Soviet-backed communist forces fought against the Polish Home Army resistance, which had fought the Germans throughout the occupation, well into 1947. In Ukraine and the Baltic states, armed resistance to Soviet occupation continued into the early 1950s. The boundary between World War II and the Cold War, in terms of organized armed violence in Europe, was much less clear than the official end dates suggest. For many people in Eastern Europe, the war simply changed its character in 1945 rather than ending. The war produced an unprecedented displacement of populations. Approximately 60 million people in Europe were displaced from their homes by the end of the war. Refugees, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe by post-war population transfers, Soviet citizens forcibly repatriated from Western Europe. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration operated camps across Europe for years after the fighting stopped, housing millions of people who had no home to return to or who could not safely return to the countries they had come from. The scale of human displacement produced by the war exceeded anything previously seen in history. The international refugee law that developed in its aftermath, the 1951 Refugee Convention, the concept of asylum as an international legal right, was a direct response to the inadequacy of existing frameworks to address what had happened. The Japanese soldier hero Onoda continued fighting in the Philippine jungle until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended, because he had not received orders to stop. He had been deployed to Lubang Island in 1944 with orders to conduct guerrilla warfare and to hold his position. His commanding officer had told him not to surrender. He did not surrender. He evaded search parties, dismissed leaflets announcing the war's end as Allied propaganda, and continued his mission for 29 years. He was finally reached by his former commanding officer, who had to travel from Japan to the Philippines to deliver the order in person, in March 1974. He emerged from the jungle in his original uniform, carrying his rifle, his ammunition, and his sword. He had kept his equipment in working order for 30 years. He was 61 years old. The women who served in the Soviet military during World War II did so in combat roles to an extent unmatched by any other belligerent nation. Approximately 800,000 women served in the Soviet armed forces as pilots, snipers, machine gunners, tank crew, and in other combat roles. The Soviet female pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, known to the Germans as the Night Witches, flew more than 23,000 combat sorties in biplanes that were obsolete at the war's beginning, bombing German positions at night by cutting their engines and gliding silently over the target. The Germans found them so difficult to deal with that any pilot who shot one down was automatically awarded the Iron Cross. The regiment flew without parachutes for much of the war. The aircraft were too small to carry them and suffered significant casualties. Their average age when the war began was 20. The Marshall Plan, the American program that provided approximately $13 billion in economic assistance to rebuild Western European economies after the war, was one of the most strategically successful foreign policy initiatives in modern history. It was also motivated by concerns that economically desperate European populations might turn to communism, as had happened in Russia after World War I. The plan was offered to all European nations, including the Soviet Union. Stalin refused it for the Soviet Union and pressured Eastern European nations under Soviet influence to refuse it as well. The Western European nations that received Marshall Plan aid recovered economically with remarkable speed. The Eastern European nations that did not spent the following 4 decades under Soviet-dominated systems that produced significantly lower standards of living. The decision Stalin made in 1947 shaped the economic trajectories of hundreds of millions of people for generations. The war's moral complexity extended to the behavior of Allied forces as well as Axis forces. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945, which killed between 22,700 and 25,000 people in a city crowded with refugees, has been debated ever since as a possible war crime. The systematic looting of cultural property by Allied soldiers, particularly in Germany and Japan, was widespread. The treatment of Japanese Americans interned in camps in the United States, approximately 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American citizens, was a significant violation of civil rights carried out by the democratic government fighting a war in the name of freedom. The war was not a morality play in which the Allies were entirely righteous and the Axis entirely villainous. It was a human event, with the full range of human behavior on all sides, fought in the name of principles that were not uniformly observed by those who proclaimed them. The Blitz, the German bombing campaign against British cities that began in September 1940 and continued until May 1941, killed approximately 43,000 British civilians and destroyed vast areas of London, Coventry, Bristol, Liverpool, and other cities. It failed to achieve its strategic objectives. British civilian morale did not collapse, war production was not significantly disrupted, and the RAF was not destroyed. The psychological response of the British population to the bombing, the famous Blitz spirit of stoic endurance and community solidarity, has been both celebrated and questioned by subsequent historians, who have noted that the official narrative of cheerful defiance concealed significant anxiety, resentment, and class tension. Both things appear to be true. There was genuine courage and genuine community, and there was also fear, looting, desertion, and the full range of human responses to terror. The myth and the reality coexisted. The code name for the Allied deception operation that concealed the true location of the D-Day landings was Operation Bodyguard, named after a Churchill quote, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." The operation involved a network of double agents, fake military units, fictional commanders, and carefully controlled leaks of false information. The most important element was a fictional army group, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSEG, supposedly stationed in southeastern England opposite Pas-de-Calais, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, and supposedly preparing for the real invasion. FUSEG had fake radio traffic, fake vehicle parks visible from German reconnaissance aircraft, and fake headquarters. It did not exist. But it tied down significant German forces in the Pas-de-Calais area for weeks after the real landings had begun. The war in North Africa, fought across the deserts of Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco between 1940 and 1943, involved a mobility and fluidity of warfare that was unlike the trench warfare of World War I or the brutal urban combat of the Eastern Front. The same towns and positions changed hands multiple times. The German commander in North Africa, Field Marshal Owen Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, became one of the war's most celebrated commanders on both sides, admired by his opponents for his tactical brilliance and by his own troops for his leadership style. He shared the conditions of his soldiers, moved his headquarters close to the front, and was known to personally lead armored thrusts. He was later implicated in the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler and was given the choice of a public trial or suicide. He chose suicide and was given a state funeral. The contribution of colonial subjects to the Allied war effort has been significantly underrepresented in popular histories of the conflict. India alone contributed approximately 2.5 million volunteer soldiers to the British war effort, the largest volunteer army in history. African soldiers from French and British colonies fought in North Africa, Italy, and France. Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, and South African forces served in every major theater. The war was fought not simply by the nations whose names appear most prominently in its history but by a global mobilization of people whose homelands were frequently occupied or dominated by the imperial powers they were fighting for. Many of those soldiers returned home after the war to find that the freedoms they had fought for were not extended to them. The contradiction between fighting for freedom and being denied it accelerated the decolonization movements of the following decades. The German military's planning for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, prepared in the summer of 1940, was, according to most military historians, logistically impossible to execute successfully. The German Navy had no capacity to protect an invasion fleet across the English Channel against the Royal Navy, which remained formidable despite its losses at Dunkirk. The plan called for landing troops on a front so wide that the available shipping could not maintain adequate supply lines across even the narrow channel. The German army commanders who reviewed the naval plan described it as a proposal to send their soldiers into a meat grinder. The Luftwaffe was expected to provide air cover during the crossing, which required first achieving air superiority over southern England, which the Battle of Britain demonstrated they could not do. Operation Sea Lion was postponed in September 1940 and quietly abandoned. It was never formally cancelled. The impact of World War II on civilian populations was not limited to bombing, occupation, and genocide. The war disrupted food production and distribution across the globe, causing famines that killed millions of people far from the fighting. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which approximately 3 million people in British India died of starvation, was caused partly by war-related disruptions to food supply and partly by British policies that prioritized military supply over civilian food distribution. The Greek famine of 1941 to 1942 killed approximately 100,000 people under the Axis occupation. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 killed approximately 20,000 people in the occupied Netherlands. The war killed not only through violence but through the disruption of the systems, agriculture, trade, infrastructure, that kept populations alive. Alan Turing, the mathematician whose work at Bletchley Park was central to breaking German codes and whose theoretical work laid the foundations of modern computing, was, after the war, prosecuted by the British government for homosexuality, which was a criminal offence in Britain at the time. He was convicted in 1952 and subjected to chemical castration as a condition of avoiding imprisonment. He died in 1954 of cyanide poisoning, officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances have been disputed. He was 41 years old. The British government issued a formal apology in 2009. He received a royal pardon in 2013. The man whose work helped win the war was destroyed by the government he had helped to save, for being who he was. The pardon came 59 years after his death. The war produced an extraordinary body of literature, art, and testimony that has shaped how subsequent generations understand it. The Diary of Anne Frank, written by a 13-year-old girl hiding from the Nazis in Amsterdam, has been translated into more than 70 languages and is one of the most widely read books in the world. Primo Levi's account of surviving Auschwitz, If This Is a Man, is considered one of the essential documents of 20th-century literature. Elie Wiesel's Night. Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. The photographs of Margaret Burke-White. The paintings of official war artists on all sides who tried to capture what they were seeing. The recordings made by soldiers on both sides in letters home. The war generated a documentary record of human experience under extreme conditions that has no parallel in history and that has been studied, interpreted, and argued over ever since. The German V-1 flying bomb, the first cruise missile, deployed against Britain from June 1944, was so different from conventional aircraft that Allied fighter pilots initially had no effective method to destroy it. The V-1 flew at speeds comparable to the fastest Allied fighters, making interception difficult. Pilots eventually developed the technique of flying alongside the V-1 and using their wingtip to flip it, disrupting its gyroscopic guidance system and sending it into the ground. Some pilots used their wing to physically lift the V-1's wing, tipping it off course. The technique required flying in close formation with a flying bomb at high speed, with the risk that any contact with the warhead might detonate it. Several pilots were killed attempting it. Others successfully deflected V-1s away from cities using the method. It was perhaps the most unusual air combat technique of the war. The Potsdam Conference of July 1945, the last meeting of the Allied leaders, held outside Berlin, brought together Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, who was replaced mid-conference by the newly elected Clement Attlee, and Joseph Stalin to determine the post-war order. Truman arrived knowing that the Trinity test had been successful and that the United States possessed a working atomic bomb. He informed Stalin, briefly and obliquely, that the United States had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin expressed mild interest and said he hoped it would be used against Japan. What Truman did not know was that Stalin already knew about the Manhattan Project through Soviet intelligence sources, including a network of spies embedded in the project itself. The two leaders circled each other in the ruins of Hitler's Germany, each concealing what he knew that the other knew, in the opening moves of a confrontation that would last 40 years. The war's legacy in Japan involved a transformation so profound that it is difficult to overstate. From a militarist empire that had been at war for 14 years, Japan was remade, under American occupation, into a constitutional democracy with a pacifist constitution that renounced war as an instrument of national policy. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, written in 1947, prohibits Japan from maintaining military forces for offensive warfare. The transformation of Japanese society, economy, and political culture in the decade after the war represents one of the most extraordinary national reinventions in modern history. The country that had launched the war in the Pacific became, within 2 decades, one of the world's most successful economies and a stable democratic state. The speed and completeness of the transformation remains a subject of historical debate. How much was imposed from outside? How much emerged from within Japanese society's own response to the catastrophe of the war? The war's most significant long-term consequence may have been the creation of the international institutional framework, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that has shaped global governance ever since. These institutions were designed explicitly to prevent the conditions: economic nationalism, territorial aggression, the absence of mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes that had produced the war. They have been imperfect, frequently criticized, and sometimes ignored. They have also, arguably, contributed to a period of relative great power peace that has lasted longer than any comparable period in modern history. The architects of the post-war order understood, from direct experience, what the failure of international institutions produced. They built replacements that have proven more durable than their predecessors. The war changed the position of women in the workforce of the Allied nations in ways that could not be entirely reversed when it ended. In the United States, approximately 6 million women entered the workforce for the first time during the war, filling positions in factories, offices, and military support roles vacated by men in the armed forces. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, the American poster of a woman flexing her muscle with the slogan, "We can do it," became the visual symbol of this transformation. When the war ended, many women were expected to return to domestic roles, and significant social pressure was applied to achieve this. Many did return. But the experience of economic independence and skilled work left traces that fed directly into the women's movement of the following decades. The war did not create gender equality. It created conditions that made the absence of it harder to ignore. The scale of destruction inflicted on European cities during the war was so vast that the rebuilding of the continent occupied the following decade and beyond. Warsaw was approximately 85% destroyed. Rotterdam's historic center was annihilated in a single bombing raid in May 1940. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and dozens of other German cities were burned out by Allied bombing. The reconstruction of Europe involved not just rebuilding physical infrastructure but making decisions about what to rebuild and what to replace, decisions that permanently altered the character of cities that had taken centuries to develop. Some cities rebuilt as faithfully as possible to their pre-war forms. Others used reconstruction as an opportunity to modernize. The Europe that emerged from the rubble was the same Europe and not the same Europe, familiar in outline, transformed in detail. The Japanese-American soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, many of whom had family members in the internment camps, became the most decorated unit in United States military history for its size and length of service. They fought in Italy and France, sustaining enormous casualties in operations including the rescue of the Texas Battalion, a unit of approximately 200 Texan soldiers surrounded by German forces, at a cost of approximately 800 casualties among the rescuers. The unit received more than 18,000 individual decorations for valor. Many of its members returned home to find that the rights they had been fighting to defend were still not fully extended to them or their families. The contrast between their military service and the treatment of the Japanese-American community was not resolved by the war that had produced it. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, involved a political decision by General Eisenhower to allow French forces to enter the city first, a recognition that the liberation of the French capital should, for symbolic reasons, be led by French soldiers. The Free French forces that entered Paris were themselves a complex amalgamation, soldiers who had fought with the Allies since 1940, members of the French resistance, and regular army units formed from French colonial subjects. The jubilation of the liberation, the photographs of Parisians lining the streets, of Charles de Gaulle marching down the Champs-Élysées, was genuine. So was the darker reckoning that followed, the punishment of collaborators, sometimes by summary execution in the streets, the shearing of the heads of women who had slept with German soldiers, the complex accounting of who had done what during 4 years of occupation. The war's total economic cost has been estimated at approximately $4 trillion in 1945 values, a sum so large as to be essentially meaningless as a number. More meaningful are the specific economic consequences: the destruction of European and Asian industrial capacity, the massive transfer of wealth and productive capacity to the United States, the collapse of the European colonial systems that could no longer sustain themselves after the war's economic and psychological costs, and the creation of the conditions, the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods system, that produced the post-war economic boom. The war that destroyed so much also, paradoxically, created the conditions for the most sustained period of economic growth in the history of the industrialized world. The reconstruction of what had been destroyed drove economic expansion in ways that peacetime investment had not. The atomic bombing of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima, killed between 40,000 and 80,000 people. Nagasaki was not the primary target that day. The primary target was Kokura, a city with a major weapons arsenal. When the aircraft arrived over Kokura, the city was obscured by cloud and smoke from fires in a nearby city. The bombardier could not achieve visual confirmation of the target, which was required by the mission parameters. After 3 passes over Kokura without a clear view, the aircraft diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The cloud cover over Nagasaki was also significant, but a brief gap allowed the bombardier to sight the target. The people of Nagasaki died partly because the people of Kokura could not be seen through the smoke. The difference between surviving and not surviving that day was the direction of the wind. The war produced an entire generation of orphans, children whose parents had been killed in the fighting, in the bombing, in the camps, or in the famines that accompanied the conflict. In the Soviet Union alone, estimates suggest that approximately 25 million children lost at least one parent. In Poland, approximately 800,000 children were orphaned. The post-war world inherited an entire generation of children shaped by loss, children who had seen things that children should not see, who had survived by means that required them to develop capacities for endurance and adaptation beyond their years, and who carried the war into the peacetime decades in ways that their societies were not fully equipped to recognize or address. The German general who commanded the defense of Rome in 1943 and 1944, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, conducted a fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula that military historians have described as one of the most skillful defensive campaigns in the history of warfare. He held Italy with relatively limited forces against a numerically superior Allied army for nearly 2 years. He was tried after the war for ordering the execution of Italian civilians in reprisal for partisan attacks and was sentenced to death, a sentence commuted to life imprisonment and then to release in 1952 on grounds of ill health. He lived until 1960. The skill of his military leadership and the criminality of his orders existed simultaneously, in the same man, making simple judgment of him difficult. This is, in some sense, a characteristic problem of the war, the frequent impossibility of separating military achievement from moral catastrophe. The war's children, the generation born during and immediately after the conflict, grew up in a world shaped by its consequences without having experienced it directly. They inherited the physical reconstruction, the political settlements, and the psychological residue of a war they had not fought. In Germany, this generation faced a particular burden, the need to reckon with what their parents and grandparents had done. In Japan, a similar reckoning, different in its form, contested in its completeness, occupied public discourse for decades. In the Allied nations, the war was a source of pride and grief that the following generation inherited without the experience that had produced it. The relationship between the generation that fought the war and the generation that inherited its consequences is one of the defining tensions of the late 20th century. The Battle of Kursk, fought in July and August 1943 on the Eastern Front, involved approximately 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and 2 million soldiers on both sides, making it the largest tank battle in history. The German operation, codenamed Citadel, was intended to eliminate a Soviet salient that bulged westward into the German lines and to restore German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The Soviets, who had learned of the plan through their intelligence networks, prepared an elaborate defense in depth, multiple defensive lines stretching back for hundreds of kilometers. The German attack was met by prepared defenses rather than the surprise they had hoped for. The battle ended with German forces having failed to achieve their objectives and having suffered losses they could not replace. After Kursk, Germany never regained the offensive initiative on the Eastern Front. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped German Jews of their citizenship and prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, were, in their structure and inspiration, partly influenced by American racial segregation laws. Nazi jurists studying American legal approaches to racial classification in the early 1930s found the American system of racial segregation, including miscegenation laws that prohibited interracial marriage in many states, a useful reference point. The influence was not a direct copying but a borrowing of legal concepts and methodologies. The American racial order that the Nuremberg jurists studied continued in legal force in parts of the United States until the Civil Rights era. Decades after the laws it partly inspired were condemned at Nuremberg as crimes against humanity. The war's end in Europe was not a single moment but a series of surrenders and capitulations that unfolded over days. The formal German surrender was signed twice, once in Reims on May 7, 1945, and again in Berlin on May 8, because Stalin insisted on a ceremony on Soviet-controlled territory. The two ceremonies produced two VE days, May 8 in Western Europe and the United States, May 9 in the Soviet Union and Russia, a difference that persists in how the war's end is commemorated today. The fighting did not stop immediately with the signatures. Isolated German units continued to resist for days, and the last German forces in some areas did not surrender until weeks after the official end. The photography and film documentation of World War II produced an archive of visual evidence of unprecedented scale. Combat photographers on all sides, some of them professionals, some soldiers with cameras, documented the war from beaches and trenches in concentration camps and burning cities. The photographs that emerged from the liberation of the camps, images of emaciated survivors, of mass graves, of the physical evidence of systematic murder, were so extreme that some newspapers refused to publish them. Eisenhower's insistence on documentation, and the work of the photographers who carried it out, created a visual record that made denial more difficult. The war was the first conflict in which photographic evidence of atrocity was systematically gathered and preserved. That evidence has been central to how the war has been understood and remembered ever since. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not the only surprise attack of December 7 to 8, 1941. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, a coordinated, multi-theater opening offensive of extraordinary ambition. The simultaneous nature of the attacks demonstrated the scale of Japanese planning and the limitations of Allied intelligence, which had expected an attack somewhere in Southeast Asia but had not anticipated the breadth of the simultaneous assault. The attacks succeeded everywhere they were launched. Within months, Japan had occupied a vast arc of territory from Burma to the Central Pacific. The military achievement was remarkable. The strategic situation it created, a Japan now at war simultaneously with the United States, Britain, the Dutch Empire, and China, was ultimately unsustainable. The war's impact on the development of medicine was profound and lasting. Blood transfusion techniques were refined under the pressure of battlefield casualties. Plasma was developed as a substitute for whole blood that could be stored and transported more easily. The antibiotic penicillin, produced in quantities sufficient for military use for the first time during the war, revolutionized the treatment of infected wounds and reduced mortality from wound infections that had killed soldiers in every previous conflict. Psychiatric medicine was forced to develop new approaches to what was then called combat fatigue, now understood as PTSD, by the scale of psychological casualties. The surgical techniques developed under battlefield conditions, working quickly, with limited resources, on catastrophic injuries, advanced the capabilities of trauma surgery by decades. The medicine that emerged from the war was fundamentally different from the medicine that had entered it. The war produced an extraordinary number of individual acts of courage that have never been fully catalogued. The Allied soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, knowing what was waiting for them. The Soviet soldiers who held their positions at Stalingrad through a winter of conditions almost beyond endurance. The submarine crews on both sides who went underwater knowing that the majority of their comrades in the submarine service would not survive the war. The resistance fighters who operated knowing that capture meant torture and execution. The civilians who hid refugees knowing the consequences if discovered. The interpreters and intelligence officers who worked undercover in occupied territory. The nurses and medics who worked in field hospitals within range of enemy fire. The pilots who flew missions from which the probability of return was openly calculated and acknowledged. The war was, among everything else, an enormous test of human courage under conditions designed to break it. The Cold War that followed World War II was, in important respects, a continuation of conflicts that the war had not resolved. The ideological struggle between liberal democracy and Soviet communism had predated the war. The Soviet Union had been viewed with deep suspicion by Western governments since 1917. The war had forced an alliance of convenience between ideological enemies. When the common enemy was defeated, the alliance dissolved almost immediately, and the underlying conflict reasserted itself with the added dimension of nuclear weapons. The post-war world was shaped not just by what the war had decided, the defeat of fascist militarism, but by what it had left unresolved, the question of what kind of political and economic order would govern the peace. The war's cost in human terms cannot be fully expressed in numbers, but the numbers give a sense of scale. Approximately 85 million dead, military and civilian combined. Approximately 20 million displaced persons still in camps a year after the fighting stopped. Approximately 11 million murdered in the Holocaust, 6 million Jews and 5 million others including Soviet citizens, Poles, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and gay men. Hundreds of thousands of children orphaned. Cities destroyed. Landscapes scarred. Economies ruined. The trauma, individual, familial, national, distributed across generations. The wound that the war made in the fabric of human civilization did not close when the fighting stopped. It has been closing, slowly and incompletely, ever since. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which dropped approximately 1.4 million tons of bombs on German cities and industrial targets between 1942 and 1945, killing approximately 300,000 to 600,000 German civilians, failed to achieve several of its stated objectives. It did not break German civilian morale. German war production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, as Albert Speer's armaments ministry adapted and dispersed production. It did, however, tie down enormous German resources in air defense, approximately 1 million personnel and thousands of artillery pieces that might otherwise have been deployed on the ground fronts. It also imposed enormous costs on the Allied air forces. The American 8th Air Force lost approximately 26,000 airmen killed and 28,000 captured, making it one of the costliest operations of the war for the Allies. The bombing campaign achieved results different from those intended, at costs higher than anticipated, and remains one of the most ethically contested operations of the conflict. The last surviving veterans of World War II are now in their late 90s and early hundreds. The generation that fought the war is almost gone. What remains is the record they left, the documents, the photographs, the films, the testimonies taken in time, the graves, the monuments, the institutions built in the war's aftermath to prevent its repetition. And the long, unresolved question of whether those institutions, those lessons, those monuments are sufficient. The war left the world with a framework for peace that has been tested repeatedly and has, so far, held against the worst possibilities it was designed to prevent. Whether it continues to hold is not a historical question. It is a present one, asked every day, in every place where the peace that was so expensively purchased in those 6 years is taken for granted or placed at risk. The dead cannot answer it. Only the living can. There is a cemetery in Normandy, the American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, that overlooks the beach where American soldiers landed on the morning of June 6, 1944. It contains 9,388 graves, arranged in long curved rows on a green lawn above the sea. The headstones are white. They face west toward America across the Atlantic that the men buried beneath them crossed in ships, in the other direction, to die on a French beach. The cemetery is very quiet. The sea is visible from every part of it. On clear days, you can see far out across the channel toward England, where the invasion was planned, where the soldiers trained, where the ships loaded in the spring of 1944. The grass is very well kept. The headstones are very clean. The names on them, the 9,388 names, are the smallest fraction of the war's total dead. The war that ended in 1945 is still present in the world it created. In the borders of nations drawn by its aftermath. In the institutions built to prevent its repetition. In the languages and cultures and populations distributed by its displacements. In the nuclear weapons whose existence it made possible and whose non-use has defined the peace that followed. In the memories, still living in a very few people, of what it felt like to be inside it. The numbers are impossible to hold. The individual stories are not. Irina Sendler burying names in jars. Nicholas Winton watching a room fill with people he had saved. Witold Pilecki walking voluntarily into Auschwitz. The Navajo code talkers transmitting in a language the enemy could not break. The night witches cutting their engines over German positions and gliding silently through the dark. The tail gunner on the Enola Gay taking photographs of what he had helped to do and not fully understanding what he was seeing. The war was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century and possibly in the history of the world. It was also the setting for an extraordinary concentration of human courage, ingenuity, sacrifice, and love, the love of people for each other, for their children, for the idea that some things are worth dying to protect. Both of these things are true. They exist together, inseparably, in the historical record of those 6 years. The darkness and the courage were not separate. They were aspects of the same event, experienced by the same people, in the same places, at the same time. The graves face west. The sea is very still. Sleep well.